The worst part about being rejected is not the actual, physical rejection itself. No, it's the long, pathetic, agonizing walk back home afterward, holding a bouquet of flowers you no longer know what to do with. It's the cold, unforgiving Scottish rain soaking completely through the thick wool of your coat, chilling you straight to the bone. It is the absolute silence of the cobblestone streets, while you silently, desperately rehearse all the clever, casual, nonchalant ways you're going to pretend that you are absolutely fine. I was 31 years old. I was an assistant manager at an independent, dimly lit antiquarian bookshop on Victoria Street, right in the historic heart of Edinburgh. And I had, somehow, against all my better judgment, managed to become the exact kind of tragic man who bought bright yellow tulips for a woman who texted him, exactly 8 minutes before dinner, that she wasn't quite feeling the spark. 8 minutes. That is not even remotely enough time to cancel the dinner reservation without sounding like a man who has just been emotionally drop-kicked onto the wet pavements of the new town. So, I ate alone. That's the deeply humiliating part I usually leave out of the story when I tell it. I sat at a remarkably small, candlelit table right near the fogged-up glass window of a classic French-Italian bistro called Le Petit Rêve. I sat there for an hour and a half, with a tall crystal vase placed squarely on the white tablecloth between me, and an entirely empty, mocking velvet chair. When the waiter finally approached, holding a notepad and a sympathetic look, I looked him dead in the eye and said, "She's running a bit late. I'll just wait." Like that sentence had a single shred of dignity left in it at all. He was remarkably European and professional about the whole ordeal. Kind enough not to make a face, offering just a curt, understanding nod. I ordered the absolute cheapest truffle linguine on the extensive menu, completely losing my appetite. I drank one large glass of heavy, oaky Bordeaux red wine much too fast, feeling the burn in my throat. And I sat there, isolated in my corner, watching other happy couples lean toward each other under the low, amber lights, while I tried my absolute hardest not to check my mobile phone every 30 seconds like a condemned man desperately waiting for a royal pardon that was never going to come. By the time I finally paid the bill and made it back to my flat in the quiet neighborhood of Marchmont, the relentless, freezing Scottish drizzle had completely softened and ruined the brown paper wrapped around the tulips. My tweed jacket smelled heavily of roasted garlic, deep humiliation, and the damp, musty upholstery of the Lothian night buses. Our flat was situated on the 3rd floor of an old, grand Victorian sandstone building. It was the kind of building with heavy iron pipes that groaned and complained in the dead of the night, and a thick oak front door that would stick firmly in its ancient frame unless you hip-checked it at the exact, precise right angle. I did the hip check as quietly as humanly possible. It was almost 10 o'clock at night, and I had to be quiet because my flatmate, Clara Hastings, had a notorious, endearing habit of falling asleep on the worn living room sofa with BBC historical documentaries playing loudly in the background, usually missing one of her thick woolen socks. Clara was 29 years old. She worked as a pediatric nurse at the Royal Hospital for Children. She was the exact kind of woman who could make a cheap bowl of instant ramen noodles look like an intentional, rustic culinary choice, rather than a desperate, exhausted cry for help at midnight. We had been flatmates for exactly 9 months, ever since my cousin suddenly relocated to London with his new fiancée, leaving me completely stranded with a massive lease in Edinburgh that I absolutely could not afford on a humble bookseller's salary. Clara had answered my frantic online advertisement because, according to her very blunt assessment, it was the only listing on the entire internet that didn't sound like a serial killer had drafted it in a basement. I told her that was honestly the nicest thing anyone had ever said about my grammar. We were friends. Good, reliable, sturdy, safe friends. Safe. That was the very specific word I forcefully used in my own mind whenever my brain decided to do something entirely reckless. Like noticing the exact, beautiful curve of her mouth when she was biting her lip, trying desperately not to laugh at my terrible, dry jokes. Or the way she absent-mindedly tucked her auburn hair into a messy, chaotic knot after a grueling 12-hour medical shift on the ward. Or how she hummed, slightly off-key but full of life, in the kitchen on quiet Sunday mornings when she thought I was still fast asleep in my room. Safe, meaning completely impossible to touch. Meaning, do not ruin the rent situation, you absolute idiot. You have nowhere else to go. That night, as I finally managed to push the front door open, the flat was completely dim, save for the warm, golden glow of the standing reading lamp by the sofa. Clara was not asleep. She was sitting cross-legged on the worn Persian rug, wearing a pair of oversized, faded tartan pajama bottoms. She was completely surrounded by a massive mountain of laundry that she had clearly spent ages folding, and then entirely abandoned out of sheer moral and physical exhaustion. She looked up the absolute second I walked into the hallway. Her bright green eyes bypassed my exhausted face completely and went straight, like a laser, to the damp, pathetic, drooping yellow tulips clutched in my freezing hand. Then they slowly, carefully traveled up to my eyes. "Oh, no," she said, her voice impossibly soft, laced with immediate empathy. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat, trying my best to force a casual, breezy smile. "A very good evening to you, too." She stood up slowly, brushing a rogue tumble-dryer sheet off her hip, her brow furrowing. "Julian, you're home incredibly early." Well, technically, I stayed for the entire scheduled duration of the date. Her eyebrows pulled together, creating a tiny, concerned crease. Technically? I held up the dripping tulips like they were the prime, undeniable evidence at a murder trial. She didn't make it. The tulips were apparently for myself. Clara's expression shifted instantly. It was that quick, highly professional nurse transition she had mastered, where deep, genuine concern arrived long before any of the probing questions did. Julian, that was my name, Julian Thorne. And usually, I absolutely loved the way she said it. She said it dryly, with a raised eyebrow, when I forgot to wash my coffee mugs in the sink. She said it with bright, musical amusement when I made awful, literary puns about Dickens. And she said it so gently, so tenderly, when the world outside the flat had been unkind to either of us. But tonight, hearing her say my name with that thick layer of pity made my chest tighten to the point of acute physical pain. I dropped my heavy iron keys into the ceramic bowl by the door with a loud clatter. I tried for casual. I really did. "It's completely fine, Clara. Truly," she texted me. It was very respectful, highly efficient, really. Saved us both the agonizing trouble of pretending my conversation about first edition books was actually interesting. Clara crossed the room, stepping carefully over a pile of folded white towels. What exactly did she say? I pulled my mobile phone out of my damp coat pocket before I could logically stop myself. Maybe I just wanted tangible proof that I hadn't invented the entire embarrassment in my head. I unlocked it and handed it to her. Clara read the glowing screen quietly, her voice barely above a whisper in the silent room. "Julian, I'm so sorry for the late notice, but I just don't think I'm feeling the spark. You're a really great guy, though." She stopped dead at the last line. She looked up from the screen, her eyes searching mine. I snatched the phone back and shoved it aggressively back into my coat. There it is, right there. The ultimate gravestone engraving of modern European dating. You're a really great guy, though. Put it on my tombstone. Clara's mouth twitched slightly at the corners, but she firmly refused to laugh at my misery. Did you already go to the bistro?" I was literally sitting at the table, Clara, with a candle. Her face completely fell. "Oh, Julian, I am so sorry." I had to physically look away from her, because sympathy from Clara Hastings was incredibly dangerous to my fragile mental state. It didn't feel like cheap, throwaway pity. It felt like being truly, deeply, fundamentally seen, which, honestly, was so much worse than being ignored. "I ate," I said, entirely too defensive. So, at least the evening wasn't a total economic loss. The French waiter and I developed a remarkably strong emotional bond over a block of Parmesan cheese. He was very supportive. "Did he turn you down, too?" she asked quietly, a tiny hint of a smile returning. Only when I asked if he could bring me a brand new personality straight from the kitchen, that finally got her. A small, genuine, beautiful laugh slipped out of her lips, echoing off the high ceilings, and just like that, the heavy, suffocating air in the flat felt a little less sharp around the edges. She reached out and gently took the crushed tulips from my hand before I even realized she was moving. Her fingers brushed against mine. They were cool from the draughty room, and the brief physical contact lasted, just half a second too long to comfortably ignore. Or maybe I was just lonely and pathetic enough to start measuring time in half seconds whenever she touched me. "These are really beautiful, Julian," she said, looking down at the damaged yellow petals with genuine appreciation. They were supposed to explicitly say, "I am a thoughtful, culturally aware man, but not overly intense." They definitely say that. They are lovely. They also currently say, "I do not know when I am utterly beaten by life." Clara glanced up at me through a loose, damp strand of auburn hair. I happen to really like that in a man. I went completely, entirely still. My lungs forgot how to process oxygen. She turned away instantly, heading toward the small kitchen much too quickly, acting exactly as if she hadn't meant to say it quite like that. Or maybe I just hadn't meant to hear it quite like that. My brain was clearly misfiring. The overhead fluorescent kitchen light flickered briefly when she flipped the switch. She opened the low cupboard, found an old glass mason jar we usually used for keeping pasta, filled it with cold tap water, and began arranging the broken tulips with far more delicate care than they actually deserved. I leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, shoving my freezing hands deep into my pockets, trying desperately not to watch her hands work. Clara had incredible hands, capable hands, steady, practiced hands. Hands that had once expertly, patiently stitched a loose button back onto my winter coat while sternly lecturing me about being a grown, 31-year-old man who owned exactly one sewing needle and absolutely zero thread. Hands that looked so delicate and fragile until you actually saw the immense emotional and physical weight they carried at the children's hospital every single day. "You really didn't have to bring these back home with you," she said, her back entirely to me, focusing entirely on the flowers. "What exactly was I supposed to do, Clara? Leave them sitting on the restaurant table like some tragic Victorian ghost haunting a bistro? I don't know. You could have given them to someone walking on the street, a stranger." "I just did." She paused. Her hands stopped moving. The tap water stopped running. The glass jar sat perfectly positioned right between us on the worn, wooden kitchen counter, the yellow tulips leaning slightly, heavily toward her. For a long, stretched out, agonizing second, neither of us moved a single muscle. Then she slowly smiled, but it wasn't her usual quick, sarcastic, flatmate smile. It was entirely different. It was quiet. It was terribly careful. It was the kind of smile you give when you are holding a wild bird in your hands and trying not to scare it away. "Well," she said, her voice incredibly hushed. "Thank you. Truly." Something heavy and profound shifted in the room. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough that I suddenly noticed the low, mechanical hum of the vintage refrigerator, the steady, rhythmic tapping of the Scottish rain against the glass window pane. The undeniable, terrifying fact that we were standing close enough that, if I just reached out my arm, I could trace the soft wool sleeve of her oversized sweater. I aggressively cleared my throat, breaking the spell. "Don't thank me. They are officially rejection flowers. They might be cursed by the Celtic gods of bad romance." "I'm not scared of a curse." "No? She shook her head, a small, defiant, beautiful movement. Julian, I work 12-hour night shifts with toddlers who bite, scream, and throw medical equipment at my head. Your cursed floral arrangement does not intimidate me in the slightest. I chuckled, running a stressed hand through my damp hair, and she leaned back against the counter, fully facing me. There was a strange, radiant warmth in her green eyes that I simply did not know how to process or categorize. Maybe that was the absolute truth of the entire situation. I had spent 9 entire months knowing exactly, precisely how to live with Clara Hastings. I knew how to split the Waitrose grocery bill perfectly down to the penny. I knew how to argue about the thermostat settings in the dead of the freezing winter. I knew how to pretend I didn't notice when she came home completely hollowed out by grief from losing a patient at the hospital, yet still miraculously managed to ask me how the bookshop was doing. But I had absolutely no idea how to stand in a dimly lit kitchen with her, looking at me like I was something far more important than just convenient, rent-paying company. "So," she said, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. "Was this the woman from the coffee shop on the corner?" "Yeah, Daphne. The one who proudly declared, loudly, that she liked rare books? That really should have been my first massive red flag." Why? Because she referred to a first edition Ernest Hemingway as a vintage hardcover. Clara gasped, placing a dramatic hand over her chest. "An absolute monster. You dodged a bullet." I ignored all the glaring, neon signs because she had very nice, expressive eyes, and she actually laughed at my terrible, niche joke about Hemingway's cats. Clara narrowed her eyes, tilting her head thoughtfully. "I laugh at your Hemingway joke." "You laugh at me, Clara, not the joke itself. There is a very distinct difference." I pointed a finger at her. "That is both highly hurtful and completely accurate." Her smile lingered for a long moment, and then it slowly softened into something much more serious, much more probing. Were you actually excited about her, Julian?" That question landed differently. It felt incredibly heavy, carrying a weight I wasn't prepared for. I looked down at the kitchen counter. There was a tiny, jagged chip in the wood right near the edge, shaped vaguely like the map of Ireland. I had stared at that exact chip through a mountain of utility bills, late-night Indian takeaways, terrible hangovers, and countless quiet Sunday morning coffees with Clara sitting directly across from me. I think I was just excited about the concept of being excited, I admitted, my voice dropping to a low register. She didn't tease me. She didn't make a sarcastic remark. And honestly, that made it so much harder to bear. "I thought maybe I was finally ready," I continued, staring at the floorboards as if the words were written there. "After Eleanor, I mean. I thought if I could just manage to sit across a table from someone entirely new and not immediately compare every single thing they did to that massive disaster of a relationship, that it would be some form of monumental progress." Clara knew all about Eleanor. Not the entire, agonizing, soul-crushing mess of it, perhaps, but she knew enough. She knew about the London engagement that spectacularly imploded exactly 3 months before the wedding day. She knew about the beautiful flat I lost, the mutual friends I lost, the entire, confident version of myself that I had packed into cardboard boxes and dragged up to Scotland on a train, only to never fully unpack. Clara's voice went impossibly gentle, wrapping around me like a blanket. "Julian, it is progress. You got stood up. It was awful." And instead of going to a pub on the Royal Mile and drinking yourself blind, or coming home and lying to my face about having a brilliant time, you came home and told the absolute truth. I finally looked up at her, meeting her gaze. There are certain people in this world who try to comfort you by saying the most obvious, aggressively positive things very loudly. Clara never did that. Clara just quietly, patiently found the heavy door you had left cracked open in your mind. And she simply stood there, waiting silently, until you actively decided whether or not to let her step inside. "That is annoyingly wise of you," I said, offering a weak, trembling smile. I'm officially clocking off for tomorrow. My wisdom quota for the week has completely run out. I smiled a little wider, trying to lighten the crushing atmosphere. Lucky me. Yeah, she breathed out, and her voice dipped into a frequency that made the fine hairs on my arms stand straight up. Lucky you. Outside, the rain suddenly got much heavier, lashing violently against the glass window pane. Clara looked down at the yellow tulips, tracing a petal with her finger, and then slowly brought her bright green eyes back to mine. Julian, did you actually, truly want to go on that date tonight? I blinked, completely taken aback by the directness. That's a very strange question. It's a simple one. I thought I did. That's not an answer, Julian. It's the absolute best I've got right now. Clara nodded slowly, accepting it, but something strange and intense crossed her face. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was something far more terrifying, something deeply, painfully vulnerable. It looked exactly as though she had just stepped entirely too close to the edge of a massive, jagged cliff and only just realized how terrifyingly far the drop was to the rocks below. I pushed myself off the doorframe, needing to escape the intensity. Right. I should probably go to my room and change out of my pathetic rejected man costume. It smells like garlic. I turned to leave the kitchen. She didn't move a single muscle. Julian, she said. I stopped dead right in the middle of the hallway. When I slowly turned back around, Clara was gripping the edge of the wooden counter with both of her hands so tightly that her knuckles were turning stark white. Her cheeks had flushed a deep, panicked, feverish shade of pink, and she looked absolutely furious with herself for speaking. What is it? I asked, taking half a step back. She let out a small, trembling, frantic laugh that contained absolutely zero humor. Nothing. Just ignore me. It's completely stupid. Go change. Clara. Her green eyes snapped up to meet mine, blazing with a sudden fire. For 9 whole months, we had lived safely inside a carefully constructed house of tiny, unbreakable rules, separate shelves in the fridge, separate laundry days, separate, completely unspoken dating lives. No probing questions asked when one of us came home late smelling of gin and regret. No lingering comments when one of us looked at the other for just a fraction of a second too long during a movie. But that night, with the freezing Edinburgh rain beating on the windows, and the physical evidence of another woman's rejection sitting in a glass jar right between us, Clara Hastings broke the biggest rule of all with just 6 devastatingly quiet words. I wouldn't have turned you down. The entire flat went dead silent. The kind of ringing silence that happens after a loud explosion. For a second, I honestly thought the sheer exhaustion had caused my brain to mishear her. Not because the words were mumbled. No, because they were far, far too clear. I stood frozen in the hallway, one hand braced flat against the cold plaster wall for physical support, still wearing my damp tweed jacket, while Clara stared at me from the kitchen as if she desperately wished she could reach out, snatch that sentence straight out of the cold air, and swallow it whole before I could process it. I stared at her. And then, I said, incredibly intelligently, "What?" She closed her eyes tightly, taking a sharp, ragged breath. Please, please do not make me repeat that out loud, Julian. I'm not trying to make you do anything. I stammered, my heart beginning to hammer violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'm just trying to make absolutely sure my damaged brain didn't magically add something to that sentence. Her eyes snapped open, wide and panicked. What exactly would your brain add? Wishful thinking, apparently, that immediately caught her attention. The deep flush in her cheeks spread rapidly down to her neck. Julian! I took one very deliberate, slow step back into the kitchen. Clara! Don't do that! Do what? Say my name like it actually matters to you. It does matter. Her fingers tightened even harder on the counter. I had personally watched Clara handle copious amounts of blood, vomit, screaming children, irate and terrified parents, a broken hospital elevator, and me attempting to assemble an IKEA bookshelf with a butter knife. I had never, in 9 months, seen her look this terrified. And seeing this strong, capable woman completely undone, it did something completely devastating to me. "You just said you wouldn't have turned me down," I repeated slowly, carefully testing the immense weight of the words in the air between us. She tipped her head back, staring up at the cracked plaster ceiling as if praying for an immediate divine intervention. "Yup, I did say that, out loud, with my actual mouth. God help me. Did you mean as a friend? Like out of some deep moral flatmate obligation?" She lowered her head, looking at me again, and despite the absolute, unadulterated panic swimming in her eyes, the corner of her mouth curved up into a reluctant smile. "Morally? I'm giving you exits, Clara. I'm actively building you emergency exits so you can walk away." I noticed. "Take one, if you want to." She inhaled a slow, remarkably shaky breath, her chest rising and falling heavily. "I don't want to." Everything inside my chest went completely, terrifyingly quiet. The entire flat suddenly felt impossibly small, so much warmer. The yellow tulips sitting on the counter suddenly looked far less like pathetic evidence of my failure, and much more like silent, glowing witnesses to something massive and life-changing. I walked fully back into the kitchen, but I stopped dead with the kitchen island firmly between us, because right at that moment, my basic survival instincts were locked in a violent, bloody fistfight between absolute hope and common sense. "Clara," I said, my voice thick and unrecognizable to my own ears. "We live together. We share a legal lease. I know, Julian. I was physically present in the room when I signed it. If this gets weird, if this goes wrong, it's already weird," she cried out softly, throwing her hands up in the air in exasperation. "You're standing over there smelling like expensive truffle pasta and emotional damage, and I am actively having a minor cardiac event on a Tuesday night," I laughed. I actually laughed, a sharp, breathless, euphoric sound, because if I didn't laugh, I knew I might do something entirely reckless, like striding across the cold linoleum floor, grabbing her firmly by the waist, and kissing the absolute life out of her before even remembering to ask if she wanted me to. She smiled, too, but the smile faded almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by vulnerability. "I really didn't plan to say it," she confessed, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach as if to protect herself. For the official record, I had a highly detailed, bullet-pointed plan in my head to literally never say anything to you. Ever, until one of us moved out. "That was your grand plan? It was very well thought out. What did it involve, exactly?" "Mostly, aggressively avoiding direct eye contact whenever you came out of the bathroom wearing only a towel. My brain entirely short-circuited. Images flashed through my mind." She groaned loudly, covering her red face with both of her hands. "Oh my God, that's it. I'm moving out. I am packing my bags tonight and moving back to Glasgow." "No," I said, much too quickly, much too desperately, her hands lowered slowly. The word "no" just hung there in the heavy air between us, echoing, revealing so much more about my own heart than I had ever intended to show her. I softened my voice, stepping just an inch closer to the island. "Don't. Please don't." Clara looked at me for a long, agonizingly quiet moment. "You don't want me to move out? No? As a flatmate?" I swallowed the massive lump in my throat, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Not. Only as a flatmate." Her lips parted slightly in shock. And there it was. The ledge. The massive, terrifying, dizzying drop. The exact place we had both apparently been standing on for months, silently pretending that the view wasn't breathtakingly terrifying. I gripped the wooden back of one of the dining chairs, anchoring myself to reality. I didn't. I never let myself think about you that way, Clara. Liar, she said, her voice a soft, echoing, beautiful whisper. I huffed a breath, shaking my head, defeated by the truth. Fine. I didn't let myself think about you that way for more than, say, 10 minutes at a time. Her smile came back. It was shy, radiant, and bright enough to completely ruin my life. When? Unfair question, I confessed first. Julian, you owe me. I looked down at the floorboards, aggressively rubbing the back of my neck, feeling the heat rise in my own cheeks. When you dance in the kitchen, I do not dance. You absolutely dance, Clara. I've seen it. I sway. I sway rhythmically while stirring soups. It's practical. You nearly demolished the kitchen bin last week while listening to ABBA. That was not swaying. That bin had it coming, I laughed, and she laughed too, a beautiful, rich sound. And suddenly, magically, we were just us again. Except, we were not us at all. Every single joke, every shared glance, now had a frantic, racing pulse underneath it. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I leaned heavily on the chair. I also think about it when you fall asleep on the sofa and then wake up fiercely angry at the television for continuing the documentary without your explicit permission. That is a highly private matter. You do it in the shared living room, still private. And when you bought my favorite expensive coffee beans last month after I had that miserable inventory week at the bookshop, and you blatantly lied to my face, pretending it was because there was a 2-for-1 sale at Tesco. Her expression shifted, the amusement melting entirely into something incredibly tender. I couldn't stop, because apparently, I had been carrying around a mental list for months without realizing it, and the dam had finally burst. When you call your pediatric patients your tiny, adorable dictators, when you purposely leave the French press full for me before your early hospital shifts, when you laugh and try desperately not to, and my voice broke slightly. I looked right into her deep green eyes, letting all the walls fall down. When you look at me, Clara, like I am not just a collection of leftover, broken pieces from someone else's life. Her eyes instantly glistened with unshed tears. I regretted the last sentence, the absolute moment it left my mouth. It was far too much, too honest, too deeply damaged. I was ruining the moment with my baggage. But Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look away from my damage. Instead, she slowly let go of the counter. She walked around the kitchen island, moving slowly, cautiously, as if I were the nervous, frightened one in the room. Which, to be absolutely clear, I was. She stopped right in front of me. She was close enough now that I could smell the distinct, comforting scent of her. Lavender laundry detergent, rain, and the faint, sweet trace of the peppermint tea she always drank before bed. She reached up. Her hands hovered for a second before she lightly grasped my tie. A silk tie I had worn for a woman who couldn't even be bothered to show up, and she began to loosen the knot with incredibly careful, delicate fingers. My breath completely hitched in my throat. I couldn't move. "You are not leftover pieces, Julian," she whispered, her voice fierce, absolute, and full of conviction. I stared down at her hands, because looking directly into her face felt like staring into the blinding sun. "No? No." She slid the tie completely free from my collar and casually draped it over the back of the wooden chair. "You are an entire, whole disaster." A laugh broke out of my chest, shaky, relieved, and so overwhelmingly grateful. Her fingers didn't leave. They stayed resting lightly against the damp cotton of my shirt front. She wasn't holding me there by force. She was just touching me, asking a silent, profound question. I answered it by slowly lifting my own hand and covering hers, pressing her palm flat against my beating heart. Clara's eyes finally lifted to meet mine. There were 1,000 perfectly logical, sensible reasons not to lean any closer. The high cost of Edinburgh rent, the absolute sanctity of our friendship, the awkwardness of shared towels accidentally mixed up in the laundry, the very real, terrifying possibility of eventually losing the only place that had felt like a true home to me in years. But her thumb moved, just a fraction of an inch against my palm, barely even there, and suddenly, every single logical reason was drowned out by the roaring in my ears. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered, her eyes dropping to stare at my mouth. "Anything! If Daphne hadn't canceled on you tonight," she winced, shutting her eyes tightly as if in physical pain. "Clara! No! Let me finish!" "I'm not asking to hurt myself. I just really need to know." She opened her eyes, taking a shuddering breath. "Would you have come home and just kept pretending with me?" I wanted so badly to give her an easy, comforting answer, to lie and say no. But she deserved the absolute truth. "Probably," I admitted, my voice thick with shame. "Because I am a massive coward." Her face softened, but she didn't pull away. "But," I added, squeezing her hand tightly, "I would have been pretending, Clara. That part matters more than anything." She nodded slowly, as if she were taking that truth and carefully tucking it away somewhere tender inside her heart. Then, because she was Clara, she let out a long breath and said, "I also really would have worn vastly superior pajama bottoms for my grand romantic confession if I had known this was going to happen." I glanced down at the faded, oversized tartan trousers. "I don't know. They are highly persuasive. Do not flirt with my trousers, Julian. I'm flirting with the woman wearing the trousers." Her smile went completely helpless. And that was the exact moment I knew that I was in catastrophic, beautiful trouble. Not just because I physically wanted her. I had wanted her in quiet, easily deniable ways for months. No, it was because I genuinely liked wanting her, because standing here with her didn't feel like panic. It didn't feel like a performance, or like I was desperately trying to prove to the world that I was healed enough to be loved again. It felt like walking out of a freezing, brutal storm, stepping into a warm, familiar room, and realizing someone had already saved you the best seat by the fire. Clara slowly drew her hand back, but only so she could point a finger directly toward the living room. "Sit. Am I in trouble?" "Probably. But first, we are fixing your disastrous date." "My date?" "Yes. You got rejected via text message. You ate sad, lonely pasta, and you came home holding flowers for your flatmate. That is not a complete, acceptable evening in this household. What exactly are you proposing?" She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with determination. "A do-over, right now. You, me, the sofa, hot tea, leftover lemon cheesecake from the fridge. I will ask you incredibly charming questions about your life, and you will pretend not to be utterly impressed by me." I stared at her, completely mesmerized by her. She arched a perfect auburn eyebrow. "Unless you're turning me down?" I moved before fear could ever catch up to me. I reached out and took her hand. Her fingers slid perfectly between mine, slotting together as if they had been waiting their entire lives to do so. "I wouldn't turn you down," I said, my voice rough. Clara's smile trembled at the very edges, but she squeezed my hand once, hard and resolute. "Good," she breathed. "Then take off your damp shoes, Julian Thorne. You are officially on a date."